Now, speaking of opportunities opening up on the political right, there's been a big conference in London this week in Westminster, the National Conservatism Conference, which is an American import, but starred lots of Tory MPs and various conservative figures from the Anglo-American community. Two of the speakers at that conference join me now, Tim Stanley of the Telegraph and Mary Harrington of Unherd. Tim, perhaps you could start by telling our viewers a little bit about what National Conservatism is, what this particular movement is, and what they're trying to do. And could you also tell us whether they succeeded in doing it in London this week?
Someone put it to me brilliantly that this conference was a seminar masquerading as a rally. So some academics put on a seminar in the centre of London. They invited politicians, and the politicians then turned it into a platform to make it a debate about the future of the Conservative Party. So to back up a little bit, there is an academic who's Israeli called Yoram Hazony, who is an expert on conservative political theory. A little bit of Zionism blended with some sort of nationalism, with some American exceptionalism. And of course, he's got a profound interest in Britain as well, because Britain is the home of Enlightenment era conservative thinking. And Hazony wrote a couple of books about conservatism and about nationalism, and came up with this. I wouldn't say he came up with the idea, 'cause it's been around for a while, but he helped to make concrete this idea that at the centre of conservative thinking should be the life of the nation. Not the individual, not free markets, not getting rich, but actually making your country a better, happier, healthier place. It's about rerouting the individual within their community. He also argues that because it's about the nation, conservatism will look different from one place to another. So National Conservatism has managed to get a big intellectual audience in the United States. It's got some money behind it, and they have been traveling the world for the last couple of years, holding conferences in various places. They've been, I think, to Italy, they've been to Belgium, been to America, and now they're here in Britain. And in each case, the reaction and the response has been different, and the nature of the conference has been different in a way that reflects that idea that conservatism will vary from one country to another. So as I said, National Conservatism came to London, they invited politicians, and they happened to do so at a moment in which the Conservative Party is cracking up. And a sort of a section of the Parliamentary Conservative Party, which is socially conservative, I'd say quite a small section, and which is grouped around Suella Braverman, took this as an opportunity to get a platform to lay out their ideas about nationhood. And of course, probably in this country right now, the most potent conservative national issue is immigration. And that was the one that came up repeatedly. But as I say, there's a slight tension between what some of us were there to do at the conference, which was to share ideas, discuss Hazony's work, provide criticism, and there was a lot of criticism as well, and what politicians did, which was turn up and make speeches that got headlines, which was fantastic for building the brand of National Conservatism, because even though it's not terribly well known, and a lot of people still don't know who Professor Hazony is, that phrase is now on everyone's lips in Westminster.
Mary, you were talking about biology and feminism and not party politics. Do you agree with Tim that I thought perhaps it was, I came and saw some of your speeches. I thought it was a shame in a way that this sort of potentially quite interesting subject to debate, obviously controversial, obviously makes headlines and so on, but it did also become a sort of, it felt a bit like Tory party conference, the right-wing version.
Perhaps a little bit. I mean, my sense from spending some time in the breakout conversations and really in the speeches as well, is that there are a great many parallels with some of the National Conservatism conferences that I've attended elsewhere, actually, and on this, in the sense that if you have a conversation about conservatism, invariably there are going to be some politicians there, and politicians are going to politic. That's what they do. So invariably, you're going to get some stump speeches, and you're going to get some people who are thinking very concretely about how this is going to play to electorates, and really singing a tune in that key. But there are a great many other reasons to attend a conference like that. And one of the things that came across very clearly to me was that there's I've written about this before, much as on other similar occasions, even elsewhere, there's quite a noticeable difference between the way the typically older politicians making stump speeches are thinking about these questions, and the way some of the younger attendees, of which there are surprisingly many. I mean, when I 20 years ago, if you went to a conservatism event, it was mostly sort of crusty old buffers in corduroy, and there was a sense that you get in some Anglican, provincial Anglican churches, that there's really nobody there under pretty much under retirement age, and that it wasn't like that at all. I think something like 40% of the attendees at the event in London that just finished were under 30. Really for a conservative event, a surprising number of them were students. I spoke to a great many 22, 23-year-old young men and women who are really grappling with the big questions. And I think there was a very noticeable gulf between the way those young people were approaching these questions and the way the stump speech makers who are really engaging with a Westminster political audience were approaching these questions. Now, I think it's good and healthy and right that we're going to have different approaches and different priorities, within an overall umbrella. But it was very interesting to bring those groups together and to begin to tease out where some of those blind spots are. And I think there's potentially some reflection to be done on those gaps that might be beneficial overall to people within Westminster going forward.
Tim, you've written a lot about American politics, and I'm sure you've been to American conferences like that about conservatism, and there's a lot of that in America. Whether conservatism is a big question that the right has been asking itself for ages. Do you think it suits British Toryism to have these sort of sometimes quite intellectualized conversations? Is it something that American movement conservatism can sort of adapt into British conservatism?
Yeah. A lot of the media pounced on the idea that this is an American import and even an American infiltration and takeover of the Conservative Party. But Freddie, you've been to US conferences, and as you know, they always begin with smoke machines, with the eye of the tiger, and with a woman and a man coming out and saying, "Hi, thank you for coming, woo!" There was none of that. In fact, there were barely any American speakers. And indeed, there was a great deal of media misrepresentation of the conference and the people who spoke at it. This was, in some regards, one of the most multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious conferences that I have been to in this country. And some of the speakers who were attacked for individual things they said, so the speaker who said we're not having enough babies was a woman. Suella Braverman, the speaker who said we need to do more to control immigration, is a person of color. Yoram Hazony is himself Israeli. There were a large number of Jewish delegates there. So the idea that this was some kind of right-wing ethno-nationalist thing, I found really quite preposterous, and was based upon one or two tweets which were put out by the organization's media team, who obviously themselves took no offense at those particular tweets. But does this go down well? Well, I think if they don't do this, there's really nothing else. You're right. By the infrastructurally in America, there are things like Heritage, which do this sort of conference all the time, and they bring people from across a very much larger country who would otherwise not meet, and they get to share ideas and they get to promote candidacies and things like that. We haven't really been doing that in Britain, and that helps to explain why there's a paucity of fresh ideas. And some of the ideas coming out of this conference really went against the grain of British conservative thinking. And in some ways, the conference was more left-wing than it was reported and was understood. So, for example, Danny Kruger gave a speech where, again, people jumped upon the fact that he referred to the normative family. We can have a debate about whether or not that is an accurate or fair or kind description of families. But if you read the other 99% of the speech, he was essentially saying that many of the problems of Britain are down to conservative economics and have been down to the legacy of Thatcherism and individualism and atomization. So actually, some of the speakers at this conference are on a journey towards the left, not towards the right. And it was very frustrating that people didn't look beyond the tweets and actually notice that.
Mary, do you not think this has been talked about in the media and in perhaps highbrow circles of the right, you could call them, for a long time? Post-liberalism, red Toryism, blue Labour. There's long been a feeling that something new has got to happen in politics beyond the Thatcher, Reagan neoliberalism, if you like. That's not a great word for it, but I think that's what most people use. And yet it never really has materialised beyond the odd conference, the odd sort of moment where people get excited about it, it doesn't really speak to electorates.
I think you're right. I mean, it's too early to tell, I think, as a Chinese premier once said about the French Revolution, whether or not it worked. It's too early to tell whether this is never going to materialize. One of the things, actually, I thought that was interesting about the really very strong media reaction, and I agree with Tim when he says that I think that there have been some bad faith representations of what was discussed. I mean, one of the standout speeches for me was an economist who was making the case that capitalism is structurally antinatalist, and this is not simply an effect of bad policy. This is not simply an effect of, real Thatcherism has never been tried. This is structural, and there are a great many other social ills that it propagates besides, which is a profoundly left-wing idea. And I think the thinker that was referenced most frequently in that speech was Karl Marx. And this is not something that The Guardian is ever going to report about National Conservatism conference, because it just doesn't compute. But I think one of the things that was interesting about this conference and about the very intense and sometimes bad faith media representation of it is that up until now, as you say, post-liberal ideas, or this sort of caucus of ideas, the upper right-hand quadrant, I think, as the nerds call it, the economically left and socially right quadrant of ideas, has been sort of kicking around amongst politics nerds for some time, but has yet to gain any sort of mainstream traction. I think part of the issue there is that there has been a great deal of amongst the respectable people, there's a certain amount of effort that's gone into making sure that those ideas are non-new, and in as much as they appear at all, they've been fairly methodically coded as low status, and as just not something that ever gets discussed amongst respectable people in Zone 1. It just doesn't happen. And I think part of the reason that the media has been so upset about this conference is that that's just manifestly not the case. Here was a conference where really those ideas are being discussed, and it's happening in Westminster. And furthermore, there are some household names there, and so in that sense, I mean, it's probably too early to tell whether this is just going to end up being recouped, as some critics from the right have suggested, by this sort of neoliberalism in a fancy dress, with neoliberalism plus culture war is the worst case scenario, really. That this just gets recouped and we get more of the same with occasional diatribes about woke. But it's too early to tell whether it's going to go that way, or whether in fact some of the more interesting thinking and the more creative thinking, which I agree is still fringe relative to the stump speech stuff, but there's still a chance that some of that might percolate through, and I think if it does so, it will be in the teeth of all the respectable people working very hard to code it as low status and as just not something which is even within the Overton window. But the fact that this conference happened in Westminster was a fairly forceful shove against the parameters of the Overton window, and I think that's a positive step. It really is.
Tim, we just had Nigel Farage on Spectator TV, and he was talking about how the Tory party always survives somehow, because despite the fact it's probably going to face an election loss in the coming months. Do you think, looking at the way British Tory politicians treated this conference, do you think the Conservative Party is going to adapt to this movement, or is it going to shun it? How is it going to adapt and survive?
Some of the biggest pushback against the conference came from what you might call liberal conservatives, many of whom did not attend it, didn't pay attention to what was said. I would just add on a side note, by the way, I was struck by the things that were not discussed at this conference. No one said, bring back the British Empire. No one said ban abortion. There's a whole host of old issues which are totally off the table now and everyone's moved on from. And yet they're the things that there's often an assumption right-wingers are saying, and they're simply not part of their narrative at all anymore. But there was a big pushback among liberal conservatives who are very powerful and influential within the party. That said, I think away from the conference, there is a growing and influential group of people who feel that the economic policy approach has been wrong. We need more industrial policy. I wouldn't say protectionism versus free trade. That's a silly way of simplifying it. But there's a sense that there's got to be a move away from the idea that the job of government is simply to get out the way. And that, I think, is the most significant shift in conservative thinking. And you might even find it among some liberal conservatives. Some Tories are starting to say, we have an idea of how people ought to be living. They should be having families. They should be buying homes. But the economic situation doesn't actually allow them to do that. So how do we create the material circumstances under which people can do those things? And some of that might involve creative government action. Now, to give a concrete example, the debate around the best way to do childcare. We all know that one reason why people are not having children, why people are not settling down, is because of the extortionate cost of raising a child. And now I think almost everyone's recognised that within the Conservative Party, that that's a failing, and that's a failure that's happened under the Tories. The debate is, should it be through the state sponsoring childcare, where you leave your kid with someone, or, as people like Miriam Cates and some of the National Conservatives would prefer, the state making it easier for women to stay at home and raise the child themselves. So there's a cultural clash over what do women want. But actually, I think Conservatives are coming around to the idea that there are areas of policy that government has to take an interest in, even if it starts to sound a bit like socialism. Because if they don't do it, you end up with a very unconservative outcome, which is people not having babies or dropping out of the workforce, which is bad for the hallowed word growth.
Mary, you spoke about women, the body, biology, but I noticed there wasn't a lot of talk about the NHS or the National Health Service. Do you think that's because it's not a policy conference, it's an ideas conference, or do you think it's because nobody really wants to tackle the NHS on the right, one way or the other?
That's a very interesting question. It hadn't actually struck me until you pointed it out just now that nobody was really talking about the NHS at the conference. But you're absolutely right. Nobody was talking about the NHS. To be honest, I think it's almost certainly the case that nobody is tackling it because it's just too big. It's just too big, and it touches on too much stuff. I mean, I forget who it was who quipped that, we're now a health service with a sort of vestigial country attached, and there is a sense of that, and nobody quite knows what to do about it. And I mean, I think in as much as it was referenced, it was probably obliquely in the several talks actually, who spoke about the impossibility of continuing an abundant welfare state with a collapsing population. Which is the existential issue for a lot of things, and is an extremely uncomfortable, wicked problem when you start looking at the confluence of where social solidarity converges with high taxation, converges with support for the welfare state, converges with population growth or shrinkage. There's a real wicked problem there, which we're already confronting. I mean, unless you're pregnant or very old, where I live in small town England, you'll be lucky if you get a GP appointment within 6 weeks. That's just the reality in a lot of places now. If people weren't talking about it, it's almost certainly just because it's too big and too radioactive. I mean, you can't do it in a 15-minute speech, and people are trying to. But maybe trying to zoom out a little bit and thinking about the structural questions which have brought us to the point where we're a health service with a vestigial country attached, and trying a few different angles to see if we can come at some of those thorny issues from different perspectives and find creative ways of thinking about it.
Tim, you made the point in your speech. You did mention the National Health Service because you said that people who are uncomfortable with the National Conservatism should think about the National Health Service.
Yeah. Well, obviously, people are uncomfortable about the word national being attached to a political label, because in their mind, it automatically goes to National Socialism. And I joked that if that is the case, then we're also going to have to crack down on the National Trust, the NSPCC and the NHS. But Mary's right, the NHS didn't come up. I think that's partly because this is an academic audience, because there was some transatlantic crossover, and it's not a debate which I think some of our guests would have particularly understood or enjoyed. In the same way that I'm not sure if you had this kind of conference, it would have been appropriate to discuss Medicare and the very particular debates around health insurance in the United States. The other issue we did not discuss is Ukraine, which I think was partly a conscious decision by the conference, because if you open up a conversation about Ukraine, I don't think you'd get anyone who says Vladimir Putin's great, but you're always terrified someone's going to turn up to speak who is Russian adjacent, right? Who is sympathetic in some way. And I think there was a little bit of political control there that the conference didn't want to go down that rabbit hole. But I think it might also just be that there's another issue that we didn't discuss, because it's not something that's part of the British rights vocabulary. There is almost 99.9% support for Ukraine among British Conservatives. And so there was no real need to touch it because we are pretty much united on that subject.
Well, it's not that I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but we do have to wrap that up. So thank you very much, Tim, and thank you, Mary.